On August 15, 1812, General William Hull stood behind the walls of Fort Detroit with roughly 2,500 men, working artillery, and a fortress the British had no realistic way to storm by force. Hull expected to hold this ground for weeks if it came to that. 3 months earlier, he'd expected something even bigger. Not to defend Michigan, but to conquer Canada. What showed up at his gates instead was an army he outnumbered nearly 2 to 1, and a deception so simple, so almost embarrassing in hindsight, that Hull surrendered his entire force, his fort, and the largest piece of American territory ever lost in the country's history, without firing a single shot in its defense. So how does a general with 2,500 men, working cannon and solid walls hand over everything he has to 1,300 exhausted regulars, militia and warriors without making them fight for a single inch of it? To understand how this happened, you have to understand exactly how confident the Americans were walking in and exactly how fast that confidence collapsed. The United States declared war on Britain on June 18, 1812. The strategic thinking behind it, in Thomas Jefferson's own words, was that taking Canada would be a mere matter of marching. Britain was consumed fighting Napoleon in Europe. Upper Canada had a tiny settler population, a garrison stretched paper-thin across an entire continent, and superiors in London who assumed, quietly, in their own dispatches, that the colony might not be defensible at all if the Americans committed real numbers to the invasion. Hull looked on paper like exactly the man to prove that theory wrong for the Americans. He was 59 years old, a genuine Revolutionary War veteran with a record that included action at Stony Point and operations around the Saratoga campaign. Not a career bureaucrat playing soldier, but an officer with actual combat experience. Jefferson himself had trusted him enough to appoint him governor of the newly organized Michigan Territory back in 1805. When the war started, Hull was handed command of the Army of the Northwest, somewhere around 2,000 Ohio militia plus federal regulars, and ordered to march north to Detroit, then push across the river into Canada. He crossed on July 12, 1812, full of confidence, issuing a proclamation to Canadian civilians promising liberation rather than conquest. And then he stalled. His supply line back through Ohio ran through contested territory, and every day he waited, that line got more exposed. The wait cost him everything. On July 17th, 400 miles to the north, a tiny American garrison at Fort Mackinac, just 61 men under Lieutenant Porter Hanks, surrendered without firing a shot. Not because they were overwhelmed by superior numbers in a stand-up fight, but because nobody had even told them the war had started before a much larger British and native force was already standing at their gate. Hanks himself would later be killed in an unrelated incident while still awaiting his own court-martial over that loss. A footnote most retellings skip entirely, but a sign of how seriously Mackinac's fall was taken. When word of Mackinac reached Hull in early August, it landed like a detonation charge under his entire campaign. If a garrison could fall that fast, that easily, then every native nation along the frontier was suddenly a live and immediate threat, not a theoretical one. On August 5th, a supply column under Major Thomas Van Horn, carrying mail, dispatches, and reinforcements toward Hull's position, was ambushed near Brownstown by warriors under the Shawnee leader Tecumseh. The ambush didn't just cost men, it severed Hull's communication with Washington at the exact moment he most needed reassurance that help was coming. By August 7th and 8th, Hull had pulled his entire invasion force back across the river into Detroit. The invasion of Canada, the mere matter of marching, was over before a single major engagement had been fought. Now it was the American general who needed a fort to hide behind, and the enemy who was about to go on the offensive. The tool that finished the job wasn't a rifle, a cannon, or a new piece of technology. It was a lie, but an engineered one, built with enough precision that it deserves to be studied as a weapon in its own right. Isaac Brock, the British military commander in Upper Canada, had almost nothing to work with. London's actual defensive strategy for the colony assumed it probably couldn't be held at all if the Americans pushed hard. Brock's own superiors wanted him to dig in defensively and wait for the invasion to exhaust itself, not go looking for a fight. Conventional military doctrine of the era said sieges were won with numbers, and Brock simply didn't have the numbers. Roughly 300 regulars from the 41st Regiment was the hardcore of what he could field on short notice. Nowhere near enough, by any conventional accounting, to threaten a fortified position holding over 2,000 men. What Brock did have was an alliance most of his own government doubted would hold. Tecumseh, a Shawnee leader who had spent years building a coalition out of nations that Britain's own officials weren't fully confident would actually show up when the fighting started. And Brock had one instinct that most professional officers of his generation would have dismissed as beneath serious soldiering: the idea that a frightened enemy commander doesn't need to see more troops than actually exist. He just needs to be convinced that he does. Staged deception on this scale wasn't standard operating procedure in 1812. To most contemporaries, it looked closer to theatre than warfare. Clever on paper, the kind of trick that collapses the instant real shooting starts. Brock bet an entire campaign, and arguably the survival of Upper Canada as a British colony, on the idea that it wouldn't collapse. Officers who considered themselves serious tacticians would have called it beneath the profession. Brock called it the only card he had left to play. Brock understood something conventional military thinking of the era refused to accept as legitimate strategy. A commander who is already afraid doesn't need to be defeated in the field. He needs to be convinced the fight is already lost before it begins. And by the second week of August, William Hull, cut off from Washington, humiliated by the Mackinac collapse, surrounded by a native alliance he could no longer predict, and with his own daughter and her small children sheltering somewhere inside the fort walls, was already most of the way there before Brock had fired a single shot. Here is exactly how the bluff was constructed, piece by piece, and it's worth slowing down for because every part of it was deliberate. Brock arrived at Fort Malden, across the river at Amherstburg, in mid-August with his roughly 300 regulars of the 41st Regiment. A real force, but on its own, nowhere close to enough to threaten a fortified position holding 2,500 men with working cannon. So the first thing he did was pad it. Several hundred Canadian militia were issued spare British Army red coats, the same uniform worn by professional regulars, and marched in plain, deliberate view of the American positions across the water. According to multiple accounts of the campaign, these columns were marched past visible clearings along the shoreline, allowed to disappear into the tree line, and then reappear further down the bank, so the same body of a few hundred men could be counted by watching American pickets as if it were 3 or 4 times its actual size. From Hull's side of the river, what looked like a single modest force became, through nothing more than repeated visibility, an endless column of reinforcements arriving in waves. Then came Tecumseh's half of the operation, and this is the part most standard retellings skip past entirely. He brought somewhere between 600 and 800 warriors drawn from a coalition of allied nations, and instead of using them for concealment or ambush, he did the opposite. He made sure they were seen, clearly and repeatedly, at exactly the moments American scouts and pickets were watching the far bank. This wasn't stealth, it was engineered visibility. Every American who reported back to Hull that day independently reported the same impression: an enemy force far larger, more coordinated, and more numerous than any intelligence estimate had suggested was possible. Layered on top of the visual deception was a written warning. A letter reportedly reached Hull's hands. The exact chain of how it was allowed to reach him still needs more digging from primary sources, suggesting that thousands more native warriors were already en route to reinforce the siege. Warriors that even Brock himself would have no realistic ability to restrain once fighting actually began. Then, on August 15th, Brock crossed the Detroit River with his combined force, brought his artillery within range, and opened a short bombardment against the fort. Not to breach the walls, his guns weren't heavy enough for that, but to set the psychological stage for what came immediately after. A written ultimatum delivered directly to Hull under flag, warning him that once a full assault began, the native force allied with Britain would be, in Brock's own words, beyond his control. It didn't spell out a massacre in plain language. It didn't need to. Brock left that blank open, and Hull filled it in himself, with his own family standing inside the walls he was being asked to defend. Just over a month earlier, this same man had crossed into Canada expecting an easy conquest. That expectation wasn't a personal failing, it was the entire premise of the American war plan, straight from Jefferson's own mouth. A mere matter of marching. Hull wasn't reckless or a coward by any prior record. He had a legitimate combat history stretching back to the Revolution, and officers who served under him at the war's opening had no reason to doubt him. But he had walked into this campaign trusting that numbers alone guaranteed the outcome, that a larger force simply wins. That single assumption, numbers as destiny, was precisely the belief Brock's entire operation was built to exploit. A commander who trusts the arithmetic stops interrogating what he's actually looking at. And when Hull looked across that river at a force he technically outnumbered, for the first time in the whole campaign, he didn't trust his own eyes. August 16th, 1812. Morning. The British guns fall silent. No infantry assault follows the bombardment. Instead, Brock's written ultimatum arrives at the fort gates, and inside those walls, William Hull is standing with roughly 2,500 men, functioning artillery, solid earthwork fortifications, and a decision he has minutes, not days, to make. He can see from the fort's own walls the redcoat columns that appeared to multiply along the far shoreline the day before. Accounts from officers present describe artillery rounds that had already landed close enough inside the fort's grounds to kill at least one soldier and wound several others. A detail that turned the threat from theoretical into immediate, personal, and close. He knows his own daughter and her young children are somewhere inside these same walls, along with civilian families who came to Detroit expecting American protection, not a siege. He knows that Mackinac fell in a single afternoon to a force nobody in Washington saw coming. And now an enemy commander is telling him, in writing, that the moment real fighting starts, that same enemy might not be a disciplined army anymore. It might become something neither Brock nor anyone else can stop. His own officers are furious. Colonel Lewis Cass in particular argues loudly that the position can be held, that the numbers are still, by any honest count, in the Americans' favor. And he has recent proof. Just 1 week earlier, at the Battle of Maguaga on August 9th, some of these very troops had already fought and won a real engagement against combined British and native forces. That victory is barely a week old. It doesn't matter. Hull raises the white flag. 2,500 men, an entire fortified position, and the whole of the Michigan Territory change hands in a matter of hours, without a single defensive shot fired from inside those walls. Here are the actual numbers, and historians still double-check them because on their face they sound almost invented. An American force of somewhere between 2,200 and 2,500 men surrendered to a combined British and native force of roughly 1,300. About 300 regulars, around 400 Canadian militia, and somewhere between 600 and 800 warriors under Tecumseh. less than half of Hull's total strength, by nearly every credible estimate, walked away with the largest surrender of American territory the country has ever recorded in its history. Combat casualties on either side that day were minimal, a detail that only makes the outcome stranger. The entire campaign's fate wasn't decided by a battle at all. It was decided by what one exhausted, isolated commander believed he was looking at across 400 yards of river water. It's the same underlying principle Hernan Cortés leaned on nearly 3 centuries earlier, an ocean and a continent away, when a few hundred Spanish soldiers used unfamiliar weapons, cavalry, and calculated psychological theatre to convince Moctezuma's court that they represented a force far larger and stranger than the exhausted, outnumbered handful of men actually standing in front of them. Different century, different continent, different weapons entirely. Same exploit, run on the same weakness. Fear scales faster than armies ever can. The fallout for Hull was immediate and brutal. The American public branded him a coward and a traitor within weeks. He was held prisoner, later exchanged, and in January of 1814 he was court-martialed at Albany, New York. The court acquitted him of treason but convicted him on charges of cowardice, neglect of duty, and unofficer-like conduct, and sentenced him to death by firing squad. William Hull remains, to this day, the only general in the entire history of the United States military ever sentenced to death by an American court-martial. President Madison ultimately remitted the sentence, citing Hull's genuine Revolutionary War service. But the conviction and the disgrace stood for the rest of his life. Hull spent his remaining years writing and publishing his own defense, insisting to anyone who would read it that he had made the only choice that didn't get women, children, and untrained militia slaughtered inside those walls. Here's the detail almost nobody puts next to that ending. Isaac Brock, the man who engineered the bluff that ended Hull's career and reputation, was dead within 2 months of pulling it off. Killed on October 13, 1812, leading a reckless frontal charge at the Battle of Queenston Heights. The exact same kind of aggressive gamble that had made Detroit work in the first place. Tecumseh followed just over a year later, killed at the Battle of the Thames in October 1813. Fighting the same American army that had, by then, retaken everything Hull surrendered. The 2 men who outthought an entire American garrison didn't outlive their own victory by much. Fort Detroit itself no longer exists. The site is buried under the modern city that grew over it, and there is no dedicated public monument there to William Hull, the man who once commanded it and gave it away without a fight. If you want a physical trace of any of this story today, you have to travel 400 miles north to Fort Mackinac, preserved and quiet on an island in Lake Huron, where tourists now walk past restored cannon that once were enough to help end an invasion before it truly began. The lesson Brock and Tecumseh proved that week has outlasted both of them by 2 centuries. The side with more men on paper doesn't automatically win. The side that controls what the other side believes it's looking at does. It's worth sitting with how narrow that margin actually was. Hull's own colonel had just won a real fight a week earlier. His men had cannon, walls, and numbers on their side. Nothing about Detroit's fall was inevitable. It was manufactured, deliberately, out of a handful of redcoats reused, a few hundred warriors made visible at exactly the right moment, and one commander's willingness to believe his own eyes were lying to him. Take away any single piece of that performance, and the surrender likely never happens at all.